Banded jumps are brilliant.
And they make you feel that it's so fun.
Oh yeah,
You go so high and you're like, oh my God, I'm so explosive. I'm not, but I feel like I am.
Welcome to the Performance Proposition, guys.
Welcome. It's a serious podcast, I promise.
For serious people. Serious people with serious moustaches and serious Christmas t-shirts, even though it might not be Christmas when we release it.
Who knows?
So today's topic is going to be about plyometric training and whether or not there is a maximum degree, a maximum amount of volume that can be prescribed when it comes to plyometric training. Proposition itself is...
There's no maximum threshold to plyometric training prescription.
And you get to defend that argument.
I get to defend that.
Brilliant.
Because I'm really lucky and I have all of the knowledge.
You do have all of the knowledge.
Do you want to go through the sort of introduction to
what plyometrics is?
Yeah, what plyometrics are.
So plyometric training basically relates to its explosive kind of jumping based exercise, realistically working on using the stretch shortening cycle as a way of stimulating greater muscle contractions. So the idea being that there has to be a negative phase where you are eccentrically loading the muscle, stretching the muscle, and an amortization phase where you're changing direction. There's the pause before you start to re-accelerate in the opposite direction, and then a concentric phase where the muscular tendinous unit shortens, recoiling, and springs you upwards.
Are we defining plyometrics as an amortization phase of less than a certain threshold? Are we going that deep or not?
It has to be low enough that the stretch shortening cycle can still take place. So yes, but I'm not going to go so deep that it has to be less than 0.25 of a second. Because
that's for another time.
That is for another time. But the idea is that the amortization phase can't be so long that the Golgi tendon organ reflex kicks in and the stretch reflex dissipates. So what happens when a muscle's lengthened rapidly, forcefully, is that the stretch receptors within that muscle that run the full length of the muscle will be innervated, and they'll provide feedback through the spine telling the muscle that it needs to contract. So there's like a subconscious control to that contraction, and that leads to a rapid shortening and propulsion in the opposite direction. So the goal of plyometric training is to capitalize on that and use a conscious contraction simultaneously alongside that neuromuscular kind of subconscious, unconscious contraction to generate the most amount of force possible. And yeah, that's the kind of primary goal of plyometric training.
Basically, lots of force produced in very, very short period of time. So if you're looking at that classic intensity, like force produced, time to produce the force, and your maximum strength trainings, or like, is it, which way around is it? Is it the inverted or that way? What's the x-axis, what's the y-axis?
So maximum force down on the y-axis.
Yep.
Maximum time to produce that force is on the x-axis.
So right at the bottom, you get plyometric reactive movements, very similar to what we get in sporting situations, which is probably the primary, if you like, population in which plyometrics are going to provide the most benefit. By sporting populations, I'm including things like runners, because I do think, that's probably, in terms of the people that are watching this, I imagine the runners are going to get the most benefit from understanding plyometrics and putting them into their programs, but equally any sport that requires high volumes of running, like basketball, football, rugby, other team sports.
I'd say any sport that requires maximum power output is going to benefit to some degree from
plyometrics.
From plyometric training.
You're going to get less from, say, a pogo hop as an Olympic lifter than you will as a runner, I would argue.
Yes, I would agree.
So we're talking more sort of athletic human movements where you're moving your body weight is going to be the biggest benefit, bang for buck, that you're going to get from plyometrics.
And then the key thing to think about is when you're looking at that curve, any training done at the bottom end of that curve is designed to reduce the deficit between maximum force that you can produce and the amount of force that you can produce within that time frame. So it's going to elevate that part of the chart a little bit. and bring it closer to your maximum force output.
Yeah.
So elevating your maximum force output will probably elevate that slightly, but it's about reducing the deficit at the level of intensity that you want to be competing at, really.
Yeah.
So typically what's recommended is that for beginners, you should do somewhere between 60 and 100 ground contacts in a session, and you should only really aim for one session a week, and that's going to provide maximum adaptation to plyometric training. As you move towards being an intermediate athlete, then you could probably do somewhere between 100 and 160 ground contacts over the course of each session, and you can start to up your session frequency towards 2 to 3 sessions a week, but you need to make sure that you have 48 to 72 hours between sessions so you can allow time to recover, so you can still be explosive in that subsequent session. And then as you move towards being an advanced level athlete, you start moving towards being able to do 150 to 200 ground contacts per session, again, still over 2 to 3 sessions. It varies between 100 ground contacts a week as a beginner up to 600 ground contacts a week as an elite level performer.
A little bit of background for the listener on like why that is the prescription, why that exists as the prevailing theory.
So my fundamental argument comes down to there's 2 key arguments for why you want to keep training volume that low when it comes to plyometric training. And the first is that you want to make sure that you're getting what you're trying to get from a given session. So like we said before, plyometric training is about maximizing power output, and that comes down to utilizing the stretch shortening cycle, so making sure that you can actually get the most unconscious control of that muscle contraction. You want to make sure that you're moving with good speed, and you want to make sure that you're applying the right amount of intent to every single rep. If I go for a session that is too high volume, too fatiguing, as I get towards the end of that session, my movement's going to slow down. My ability to motivate myself for every single rep is going to reduce. And as a result, I'm not necessarily going to get the result that I want from that session. I might actually get the opposing result from that session, which is less unconscious control, less recoil, and more conscious muscle contraction and inefficient movement patterning. So I don't want to go too high in terms of volume in order to reduce the risk of that happening. But then the other side of it is that plyometrics is obviously really high impact. There's a large amount of eccentric muscle contraction or a large amount of eccentric load. And there is, as a result, quite a lot of strain put on connective tissue, put on joints, put on fascia that aren't going to recover as quickly. And you need to give yourself more time between sessions. You don't want to overload that system as much as you would necessarily with like a muscular contraction. So, and it's about minimizing injury risk. So managing load, minimizing risk, making sure you get the most out of every single jump.
So I'm gonna counter your point, but I'm gonna strengthen it at the same time.
Okay,
well, not
cool.
counter it, but I think just add a little bit more context in the sense that, so what you said about the fatiguing thing. So that's another thing to be aware of with plyometrics, is because it's not high weight, it's not gonna feel fatiguing in the same way.
No.
Like people aren't gonna, like if you're not used to doing them, you're not gonna feel it as being hard.
Yep.
And then the next day you will feel it.
Yep.
Because it's predominantly tenderness, it's really quick.
Yep.
There's the force is being produced so quickly, your body doesn't have time to be like, oh, this is actually really hard, I'm having to push through it. Like there's no drag, there's no grind involved in that training. So like often people will do it and not quite realize what they've done.
Yeah.
Until they wake up the next day and they're like, all of my joints hurt.
Yeah. All of my joints hurt, my muscles are in bits, I can't move.
If you're advanced with training, you'll feel that drop off, like you say, you won't feel as powerful. But if you're not used to that feeling of drop off and that feeling of like lack of power, you'll just keep doing it and you'll be like, I feel like I'm doing the same thing, but you'll just be moving slower and slower and slower. Yeah. So like, I think that's like it's an important like bit of context to add, because some people might hear that and go, well, I'll just try it and I'll stop when I start to feel the
like
drop off, and you're like, well, you won't. But then the next day you'll be like, holy shit.
Yeah. You won't notice that slight change in ground contact time. You won't it's also that the sense of fatigue kicks in after the set's finished a lot of the time with plyometrics. So normally you'll do your plyometric set. As you're doing the set, you'll feel absolutely fine. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you'll stop, and the amount of like your breathing rate will shoot up, your heart rate will shoot up, you'll start sweating. And you'll be like, oh, cool, that was more time. In the same way as like you would with sprint training, really. It's just a different way of experiencing fatigue that until you're used to it, you don't really want to push too hard into it.
Some case studies from a big group that we'll all recognize as runners, and another little bit of research that I came across in my master's that blew my mind at the time. And you may or may not have heard it before, but I think it's a really useful thing to understand about it. So it's in the same vein as what we just talked about. So I'll get into that first. So they did a study. They took some average people on the street, weren't experienced in plyometrics. They took another group, high-level sprinters, long jumpers, explosive athletes explosive people, right? Yeah. And they measured the ground reaction forces while doing plyometrics. Your beginners, your people that weren't used to it, couldn't produce a lot of force, produced negligible ground reaction forces. Like, they were trying their hardest, but they did it, and they woke up the next morning and they were like, I could do this again, and they did it, and I could do this. Like, their soreness, nothing changed, all of that sorts of stuff. The athletes produced between 7 to 12 times body weight per rep. So we're talking like 1 to 1.5 body weight per rep in terms of ground reaction forces. 7 to 12 times body weight per rep. Right? Now, those guys did it once. They couldn't do it again for like 96 hours. Because they were so fucked. And like, that's where I think sometimes like this prescriptive beginners, intermediate, advanced, it over dilutes it a little bit.
I think it's the interesting thing with like any type of training, right? Because actually you take a beginner and you get them doing maximum strength training or maximum power training, and actually they're nowhere near what their max capacity is, because they're not even. So they're pushing as hard as they can in every session, but actually the percentage of maximum effort they're able to produce, because they haven't got the skill to produce it, is so low that of course they can repeat it pretty much every day, and they can get away with doing quite a lot more volume than you would typically prescribe. I suppose like when you see people talk about plyometric training, like normally the prescription of plyometric training comes after a phase of, so they go through a robustness training phase, they go through a phase of developing dynamic stability, mobility, strength, like eccentric strength as well, and then it comes once they've done that, they then go into the plyometric training phase. So typically they've gone through 6 months of training, they've prepared their body for that plyometric training, and then they're...
So to me, like when you're looking at like plyometric research, when you're reading it, what you tend to find is that the two exercises that get used most often is like people doing plyometrics, pogo hops and drop jumps. And when I say drop jumps, please do not go and try and figure out what the research says is a drop jump, because I remember writing my dissertation, and because I did my postgraduate dissertation in training plyometrics in youth football players, and we did drop jumps. Now, drop jumps are stepping off a box and doing a reactive pogo hop from height. The literature will tell you that a drop jump is a depth jump. And they will use all sorts of, like, there's so many terms, but what we're talking about here, just for complete clarity, drop jump, step off a box, straight legs, rebound like a pogo hop. Depth jump, step off a box, drop into a deep squat, and then jump.
Well, drop into
at
least the athletic position.
At least the athletic position. But basically, it's not plyometric, a depth jump, in my opinion.
A depth jump?
A depth jump.
A depth jump's plyometric?
No.
Is that because of the fact you don't view anything that's over 0.25 of a second? Yeah, okay, fine. Because surely that depends on where the stretch is being detected, which stretch receptors are firing, what sequence, all of that.
It's a ground contact time, really. Like, that's
If you break it down into ground contact time, then anything that involves a counter movement jump isn't a plyometric exercise.
No,
but it is.
Not at all.
But it is.
It's not.
But it is.
But anyway,
okay, fine.
Let's hold that. Let's keep that fire.
Right, cool.
And let's push it into the future.
All right, fine.
And we'll come back to it. I mean, I feel like the coin flip is going to be really tense when we talk about the next subject. Because I've actually come up with an even better one while we've been talking. But either way, you get like an average person to do a pogo hop. And they're probably getting about that far off the floor. And they're using their quads, and their knees are bending, and their hips are breaking. So like, in reality, like, they could do 300 pogo hops and they'd probably be fine. Do you know what I mean? Like, the 60 to 100, like, they can do way more. And especially if you do, like, so the stuff that I did
in my mind, I was just imagining a set of 300 as opposed to like 300 over the course of a session, and I was like, I mean, that's pretty harsh.
I mean, that's pretty harsh. I don't know if I could do it.
It's basically just skipping, but you know.
Exactly. This is kind of where my point kind of comes into, that, like, you know, activities like skipping, plyometric activity. Activities like running, predominantly plyometric activity, and people every single day do well over 60. I mean, could you imagine doing a run that was 60 ground contacts?
Yeah, that'd be great.
To the end of the road.
I don't think I'd do it for the same distance you covered on the weekend, but
No. Like
yeah.
that's kind of
Yeah.
that's my whole point around the beginners thing. Like when we talk about upper thresholds, I'm going to come back to the
I
classic
think
thing we
that's
have
the
in this
kind of
podcast.
thing that's understand, like just funny about this conversation, just full stop, right? It's the whole thing of it takes away from the idea of different intensities and different goals. It's like anyone who's doing plyometrics is training for maximum power, and anything other than that, anything that kind of pushes you over the threshold, over the prescribed limits, is no longer going to allow you to train for maximum power. But just because of the fact you're not training for maximum power doesn't mean you can't use plyometrics within your training.
I mean, it's the same with everything, and it comes back to like the common theme of our, I guess, conclusions in this podcast, that like it's so context dependent, because like in reality, a beginner, when they're doing plyometrics, the first thing you've got to get them to do is actually do a plyometric, like actually make a pogo hop plyometric. Because if you get them to do that, then I agree, 60 to 100 ground contacts is probably going to be like enough for most people in terms of if they're actually pulling their toes up and attacking the floor and rebounding and keeping their quads tight and their hips tight and their abs flexed and everything's like they're a fucking loaded spring with each jump, then 60 to 100 ground contacts, like your Achilles is going to be like, hey, dude, you do more than that, fuck you. Do you know what I mean? And then but it's the same as, like you said, if you've got someone that thinks that 40 kilos is their maximum squat because it feels difficult and they don't want to go beyond that, you could get them to do 100 squats at 35, 10 sets of 10 at 35, and they'd probably be fine. But then if you take someone whose actual 1RM is 180 and you try to get them to do 100 squats that close to their 1RM, it's not happening.
But it's also that whole thing of like that initial person who feels like 40 kilos is their maximum weight. Yeah. Their maximum weight is probably 65, 70 kilos, 80 kilos. But they've just not unlocked that capacity yet. So realistically, like you're working at 95% of their 1 rep max, you're actually working at around about 45% of their 1 rep max, because what they think is their 1 rep max is half of their actual true capacity. Yeah.
And then the second half of my argument is like the upper limit changes as you adapt and you develop a chronic exposure to a movement. So you got the guy that's running the length of Africa at the moment, doing hundreds of thousands of ground contacts at a time, recovering from it, doing it again, recovering from it, doing it again, recovering from it, and it's all because he's got so much chronic load built up. Because like we spoke about the other day, your tendons, they can adapt, same as your muscles, they can react and things like that. So when we're trying to put these arbitrary like limits on, you should do this many ground contacts if you're a beginner, and this many if you're intermediate, and this many if you're expert, and it's like, but what if you're...
But it's also that individual who's running that far, that like when we talk about those ground contacts, when we talk about having a cap of 200 ground contacts in a session, like realistically that individual is not doing more than 10 reps per set. They're doing 20 sets across 4 exercises, 10 reps each time, and aiming for like near enough maximum effort for those 10 reps. That's very different to like an individual who's running a marathon and the percentage of effort that's going into each stride.
But it's still a plyometric.
It's a plyometric, but it's not, even though it's a plyometric, you're not having that. You've not got the same degree of eccentric load. You've not got the same degree of force output. You're not requiring the same amount of tendon recoil. You're not producing the same amount of stress on the tendons. So one is maximum power, maximum intent, maximum intensity, and the other is submaximal, focusing on sustaining power output for a really long period of time.
But we're talking about no upper limit to ground contacts for plyometric
movements. But it depends on what you would class as a plyometric movement. So if you're class, but that's the argument, the reason why they've put the upper limit, the reason why that argument's in place, the reason why people say you shouldn't do more than 100 in a session or 200 in a session, is because the intent behind those plyometrics, the reason you're programming those plyometrics based on their argument, is to develop maximum power. The guy going out and running a marathon isn't trying to develop maximum power with each stride. But fundamentally, like I don't disagree with your argument. I think what you're saying is completely fair. It's the same as if you were looking at kind of CrossFit athletes and the amount of jumps that they do over the course of a session or over the course of a week. Like they might do well over the prescribed amount for their level of athleticism. But the goal of their sessions isn't to develop maximum power in every single case. Quite a lot of the time, it's actually just to improve power endurance.
Interestingly, theoretically, do you think that if you were working like let's say we're working within that bubble where like someone is doing every rep to produce maximum power, and they progress through that like 60 to 100, like all the way up to the advanced one. Do you believe that advanced one is the absolute limit of like what they could do in a session and be able to recover from? Or do you think that like, so let's take a look at like an elite level sprinter or someone else who's like every single thing they do is maximum power and every single ground contact is maximum power. Do you think that as they develop a chronic load, and this is assuming they stay injury free, right? As they develop that chronic load across time, do you think that upper limit increases and gets bigger?
I do, but I also don't necessarily think it's necessary to increase it, because I think at a certain, in the same way as like if you're working with Olympic lifters, it is very unlikely that you're going to increase volume beyond a certain point. You're probably going to change things up, so you reduce the volume, increase the intensity. You have more regular like athletes, like higher level athletes, because the strain that we're placing on the body with like plyometric training and power training is going to put a lot of strain on connective tissue. The frequency of deloads is going to be higher. The need to recover your central nervous system is going to be higher. So I think there's no need to necessarily push beyond 200. I think you could theoretically push way beyond 200. You could push up to 400. You could push up to like it's possible, but the necessity to isn't really there. Like I think you can develop maximum power output.
And if we come back to that elite athlete study, you know, like yes, your theoretical volume could increase if you were producing the same force, but now because you've done so many of them and you're so good at doing them, you're producing more force. And in reality, the more volume you do, the more fucked up you're going to be for a long period of time. So it comes down to, you know, what with so much of training, it's never about how much can you do. No. It's about how much can you do and recover from and then continue to do to get the adaptation that you want.
Yeah, right. And it's that whole thing of like, when do you need to recover? And it's not just, so like, I think training for strength and training for power are so different, because when you train for strength, the primary focus is on developing muscular tissue, and you can tell when you need to back off, typically because of the fact you'll see a drop off in performance, or you'll see some kind of change, or you'll have soreness. More soreness than normal, so you'll have that back off period, and you'll be able to be more conscious about more reactive as to when you program a deload. When it comes to power training, like you kind of almost want to program deloads a little bit more systematically, because of the fact you might not necessarily notice that you're in trouble until all of a sudden you've got tendonitis, tendinopathy, or a tendon rupture, and those are things that you don't really want to be pushing into. You kind of want to, so it's that whole thing of like, I want to overreach less frequently, but because of the fact I'm overreaching less frequently, I resensitize myself to any stimulus that I'm providing with my training anyway. So say I do 2 weeks where I do 200 reps a session, 3 sessions a week, but then I back off and I drop back down to doing like 100 jumps or ground contacts over the course of a given week for a week, maybe 2 weeks. Then as I start moving back up through my rep schemes, I'm gonna have resensitized my body to react and adapt to that training, so I can get back up to 200, do 200 for another couple of weeks, back off again, repeat, repeat, and I'm gonna make much better progress.
Well, it like you say, it all comes down to like your maximum threshold and what you can recover from, right? Same with all training, like you look at some of these Russian like athletes back in the 1990s, and you look at the volume of plyometric work they did, and then you're like, I'm pretty sure there's only one way to recover from that much plyometric work and be that good. but do you know what I mean? Like, and some people will be able to recover more. I mean, like, for example, let's just fuck around with the numbers, and let's say we've got a football. So I sent you that guy, didn't I? The NFL linebacker,
the 380 pound,
6'8" linebacker.
Yeah.
Right. Him doing 200 plyometrics a week is very different to, say, a 5'4"
boxer.
weighs
55 kilos.
Also has no upper body mass. Right. Like very little. Like very very useful, very functional upper body mass, but very little. Whereas you got rugby players, that football player, the extreme other end of the spectrum, where all of their mass is up here, and all of this tissue is all very like lean and robust and explosive.
Yep.
And you're like, the degree, like how many plyometrics that person can do,
Yeah.
like they're probably going to be like 150 rather than 200.
Yeah.
You know, whereas if you've got a sprinter whose body is designed, like they've got less upper body mass,
Yeah.
they've got more lower body mass, and it's all the stuff producing the force is the useful stuff. They're not having to move anything that's not useful. They're going to be at the upper end. They're going to have a higher ceiling to be able to cope with that.
So one of the arguments I saw that I thought was like a really reasonable argument on this one was the whole idea that those upper limits are prescribed in complete isolation to all other modalities of training.
Yeah.
So they don't take into account any other high impact work that you do. So actually that sprinter, they're going to have a much better capacity to recover. They're going to be much better conditioned to plyometric work. But actually all of their training could be seen as plyometric work. So then adding another 100, 200 jumps.
Yeah, so for the
a week.
listeners' clarity, the limits that we're talking about are strength training limits, not total training limits.
Not total training limits, exactly. So it doesn't take into account sports training. It doesn't take it. So that sprinter, basketball players who jump like 100 times in a basketball session trying to catch rebounds, like that, like trying to dunk over their opponents, like that doesn't count.
I go back to Scotland and Wales, and like the emerging research at the time was, like we said about the runners, the low speed running didn't have it wasn't really related at all. Like the volume wasn't really related at all to injury.
Yeah.
The ones that were running above 7.5 meters per second, i.e., getting into reactive plyometric sprinting.
Yeah.
And that, like chronic exposure to that and acute spikes in exposure to that, were heavily linked to non-contact soft tissue injuries. And you're like, oh, I see.
But then the thing that's interesting, right, is that actually like quite a lot of runners end up with tendonitis and tendinopathies in spite of the fact they aren't doing high intensity sprints, but that's because of the fact they haven't done any strength training. The more strength training you do, the more robustness you have to deal with impact, deal with load.
But I also think it's like I'm training a guy at the moment, right, and his goal is to run 5K.
Yeah.
And he's got hypermobile ankle, all sorts of stuff, right? And like it's not even him like running really quickly that's the risk factor. Whenever he starts to get pain, it's when he starts to push himself to his like upper limits of how fast he can run. So like even if you're looking at his pace and you're thinking, oh, that's not that quick, but for him that's quick. But the second he slows it down, it's fine. Yeah, but
then he'd probably end up with in spite of the fact he's not pushing himself near maximum effort. He's still it's still going to lead to excessive stress. It's just understanding what your capacity is for overall training load. Like so intensity multiplied by volume. Yeah,
I mean, but you know, like I look at me running that marathon the weekend, and like how well my body has coped with it, and I was like I kind of knew that it would, but I was asking myself the question, I was reflecting on it, I was like, you know, why?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, because I spend so much time doing like low-level plyometrics, robustness work on my knees and my hips, like adduction, abduction. Then I was like, also, I played football from when I was like 5 to 12, and then played rugby from 12 to 21, and then like continued to like basically run. And I have so much chronic exposure in my joints that it means that like people, you know, when I told people I'm just going to go run a marathon, and they're like, are you going to train for it? I'm like, no, I'm just going to go run it. And they're like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, you're going to get injured. And I was like, I'm not. Like, I'm just going to keep running.
Good enough training history to deal with it.
Like, mercifully, I proved myself right, because I was like, oh yeah, sweet. Like, my body's just used to running and dealing with that kind of impact, and the threshold is there.
There's also a very real chance that you might have overdone it. Like, if you might not have been ready for it.
Oh yeah, I mean,
but I think the thing for me, the thing I find interesting about kind of like the whole movement towards ultra endurance running and ultra endurance events in general is like, before, running a marathon was a mental challenge, not a physical challenge.
Yeah.
Being able to complete a marathon as a member of the general population was about being able to prove to yourself that you could hit a wall and then drive through that wall. And nowadays, everyone trains up to the marathon to the point that a marathon actually feels pretty comfortable for most people if they go through a proper training plan.
Yeah.
So now we have to find new challenges and new ways of pushing yourself, and that's just by extending the distance out and making it a level of distance that there's no way of really training to prepare yourself for.
But equally, loads of people will run a marathon, and this is one of the reasons why I didn't train for it.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about how much can you do and recover from.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why I didn't spend 6 months training for it is because like so many people will train and they'll do too much over the 6 months, and they'll think like, oh, it's fine, I'll take like 1 week at the end and I'll taper, and then I'll go run my marathon, I'll be fine. And they fuck themselves up because they've actually reduced their capacity to run like that distance.
See, but then I'd just say that's poor training.
But this is
Because
what
like
it is.
you could definitely have like done some training and done your marathon faster.
Yeah, but it would have required a much longer time period than like most people would. Like most people will start training for their marathon maybe like 3 months beforehand, and at that point, your joints are just going to be like in worse condition than when you actually do the marathon than they would have been had you just run a couple of times and then like got your pace and gone. Do you know what I mean? Like you say, and then that becomes it's just a mental thing.
If you give yourself 3 months to train, you just might not be able to and you're going from 0 to marathon in 3 months. You might not be able to do what a standard 3-month marathon plan entails. But you definitely there's definitely a sweet spot somewhere between no training /2 sessions and full marathon plan would allow you to improve your tolerance. Not necessarily improve, like you probably wouldn't do all the interval training and sprint training that you would include in a standard 3-month marathon plan. Yeah. But you do a reasonable amount of volume that allowed you to adapt, build connective tissue, build up joint strength, build up stability, build running economy and movement efficiency, but without
it's also
putting too much pressure on your joints and allowing your joints to recover enough for you to compete on race day. Yeah,
and it's also just pacing. I mean, like I ran like almost every mile at somewhere around the 9:30 mile, right? Like between a 9 and 9:30, and a couple of them were at 10 when it got really, really fucking hard.
Yeah.
If I tried to run the whole thing sub 9-minute mile, I would have been so fucked up.
Yes.
So fucked up. And like I have the capacity in me, like in terms of the way that I move and like the amount, like the speed at which I can run a sub 20-minute 5K.
Yep.
You know, I can run a 6-minute mile. And so like, it's not that the capacity is not there, but like you said, and this is what I tried to explain to that client the other day. I'm like, dude, it doesn't matter what pace you're running at. We just need to find the pace where you can accumulate volume and then slowly increase that intensity. And this is where I guess this little tangent loops back to the plyometric stuff. Is it's like, it doesn't fucking matter how much volume we do, as long as it's under the threshold and it's like learning. And like with the running stuff, like for me, it was just like pacing, like learning what that pace feels like, learning how that movement was. And it's the same with the plyometrics, like learn it. I mean, like I said, I did my master's dissertation with bands. Yeah. And like learning how to jump with bands, because it reduces the ground contact time. It gives you a ground contact time closer to what you're going to experience. Yeah. It deloads you on contact as well, so you get less ground forces.
Well, that's the other interesting one that we didn't even get into, was the whole idea of whether or not you could use like aquatic plyometrics, so like jumping in a swimming pool, to still increase maximum power, but you're not exposing yourself to the same amount of eccentric load, so you can do it.
I mean, mate, the bands we showed. We showed that like their drop jumps improved, their jump height improved, like their ground contact force on the jumps improved from literally jumping, holding band. Because we did plyometric group, band group. Yeah, they improved by the same amount, because at that point,
I love that exercise, by the way. Yeah, banded jumps are brilliant.
And they make you feel that it's so fun.
Oh yeah,
like, you go so high, and you're like, oh my god, I'm so explosive. I'm not, but I feel like I am.
You are that explosive.
I am. Yeah.
I feel like you could probably jump that high without, but you just hold the bands to make us feel better.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean I guess to kind of try and wrap this up and go, what statement are we making here? Yeah. And I think if you take our statement, like there is no upper threshold to plyometric training, and you balance it against the statement of there is an upper threshold, I think the one that is more true is there is no, because it's so context dependent and it's so theoretically possible to like do so much. And the only way that this statement is true on the left is, like you say, if every single rep that you're doing is with the intent to produce.
So for me, there is an upper limit, if you're trying to increase maximum power. And once you reach the upper limit, if you want to progress things further, I wouldn't necessarily increase training volume. I wouldn't increase ground contacts. I'd increase the
effort,
difficulty of the movement and the effort applied to the movement. But the second that you're not just training for maximum power and you're starting to think about incorporating plyometrics into power endurance, or like thinking about ground contacts along the lines of sprinting, running, etc., then we start to shift in favour of the basic premise that there is no upper limit. And it's just about being sensible. Like, realistically, it comes down to designing a program that manages load effectively so that you can get exactly what you want to get from your training without getting injured. Yeah, and that's kind of it.
I like how you're like, should I do a third point here? No, that's pretty much it.
That's it.
Maximise what you want from your training without getting injured.
What I want from my training, don't get injured.
That's literally it.
Yeah. So that's that topic covered.
If I could find a training program that did that, I would be so. I mean, I say that like most of my injuries are usually my own fault.
Well, yeah, but like that's it. Like I think both of us have the issue that we know the limit.
Yeah, and the limit does not exist.
And then we don't listen to the limit. Yeah. We're both there like, oh yeah, like I should only really do this much. I know I should only do this much. You get into a session, you're like, oh, I kind of fancy doing this much today. Yeah. And then you're fucked.
Like when you got in my head the other day about the fucking hurdle height.
I mean, in all fairness, the hurdle height.
I did the hurdle height. I did the hurdles the other day, and it took me about 3 minutes to like get out of my head that I couldn't make it over, and I was like, but Zab said I should be doing these hurdles.
Yeah. Just wait, I'm going to buy some higher hurdles now. So next week's topic.
So, like I said, it came to me while we were introducing the topic.
I love the fact, by the way, that over the course of this video, it's got really dark outside. We've been relying on natural light, and now the only light that we're getting is the light from the Christmas tree.
So we're shimmered in festive
glory.
Yes. There's no such thing as an upper body plyometric movement.
Whoa. No, I mean, that's so easy to disprove.
Is it?
Yes.
Is it?
Yes.
Is it?
Yeah.
The coin flip's going to be so funny.
But based on your own definition, like, I can do a straight-armed, like, plyometric push-up variation, similar to a pogo.
Can you get it under 0.25?
Yeah, easy. Just put a band around my chest.
The research would disagree.
I guarantee you I could.
Do you want to lock that in, or do you want to go with our other one?
We talk like I'm saying like from a so fingertips on the like active, no arm bend upon landing. So I keep so first rep obviously I'm going to do a push up and throw myself up into the air. But after that, just bouncing when I hit the ground, I can get that under 0.25 of a second. I will record that before next week and then just present it and be like, here is a plyometric upper body exercise.
Right, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. If you can record that and I'm satisfied that it's a plyometric upper body exercise, when you bring it next time we film, okay, then we'll forget about the topic completely. If I'm unsatisfied with the video, then that will be the next topic.
All right, deal.
Okay.
Deal.
Cool.
Okay.
So I've completely forgotten what we said the topic would be. Intensity.
Yes. Yeah. So let's go with intensity is the key factor when it comes to developing maximum strength.
I like it.
Cool.
And today's coin flip, I bought this in Copenhagen specifically for our coin flips. Okay. I mean, from next week, I think we're going to go with the Krona.
The Krona, okay. But
today, for this week, because I bought it specifically, I feel like it has to be christened.
Has to be.
Okay.
Cool. I'm ready.
So, 20 is tails. The weird factory is heads.
Okay, fine.
There's so little light in here. I wasn't sure if I was going to.
I thought the coin had actually genuinely disappeared. I was like looking up here, and it was down. It was already in your hand.
Yeah. So tails is
you get to defend.
I get to defend. Yeah. The intensity is
the most
important factor.
Yeah.
Heads.
Okay, so I have to defend.
You had to
intensity
defend
is
that.
the most important factor. Fine, deal. I can cope with that.
Yeah, I can cope with that.
I can cope with that. I mean, yeah, you should be able to cope with that. But I will cope with this.
Which way do you think Zab's leaning on that argument, guys?
I'm leaning that intensity is the most important factor. It's the only thing that matters when it comes to developing maximum strength.
#party line.
I'm just going to come in, and that is going to be the only statement I make for the whole thing. I'm just going to have one little.
Yeah. I watched an Instagram video the other day of like the worst way, like the best worst ways to win an argument, and one of the things is just every time someone finishes talking, just go no follow up, just no, and then like while they're talking, those two.
Nice.
Just frustrates them to the point of like completely losing the argument, snowballing, and you
just-
win an argument you should never have won.
I just feel like the other two ways are basically frame the argument yourself so that it's impossible for you to lose. So also known as the Crowder approach. And just do what every single politician does. And don't worry about the question. Don't worry about the opposing argument. Just say your standard.
Intensity is the only thing that matters.
Intensity is the only thing that matters.
So what do you think about
If you train at near maximum intensity, you will get stronger. That's going to be the line.
I guess I concede. We can't both do that though, because it would just be a terrible watch.
I mean, it would basically be Instagram.
It'd just be every other video on Instagram. Cool. Good conversation.
Great
Once
conversation.
again, we have
Always.
concluded that neither of us win because the argument is entirely contextual. And tune in next week for another
episode when neither of us win.
Neither of us win. Although Zab seems pretty confident, so who knows.